Hi everyone, welcome back to our videos. Today, together with me, Victoria Rodríguez-Roldán, and she would tell you a little bit more about your activism. Please, Victoria, tell about your activism when you work with government and with non-commercial organization.
So I first started. I'm a lawyer and I work primarily around disability issues, healthcare issues. I work right now at AC United in Washington D.C. here in the States, working HIV policy. Before that, at um, the National LGBTQ Task Force, directing the Disability Justice Project and the Trans Justice Project there. And before that, that was my first job out of law school was at the U.S. Department of Labor Civil Rights Center, working on non-discrimination issues like disability and so on. So yeah.
Thank you. And can you tell a little bit about your own disability and your attitude toward your own disability?
Well, I identify as autistic, as someone with bipolar disorder. And in my case, I would say that I just see it as an integral part of myself, as something that without it, I wouldn't be who I am, even though it can be at times a bit of a pain in the ass, basically. So, and I think my goal would be I sometimes try to avoid talking too much about my own situation because I am so privileged about it, but instead focus a lot on how, in general, people with disability, intellectual, developmental, and mental health disabilities are treated globally and in this country in general.
How you start working with the government?
It was through a Schedule A job. Basically, in the U.S. government and the federal government, there is a Schedule A type of hiring, which prioritizes people with disabilities and allows you to skip the job announcements on the USA Jobs website, which basically meant that I could be hired sort of the old-fashioned way of we want to hire you, let's just do it. And I was offered that through a position, through a friend who had been my boss in a prior internship. She knew them and were looking. I had just graduated law school, so I was looking for a job. And honestly, that was a big part of my coming to terms with my having a disability, the whole you're eligible for this because of your disability. And I have this mental image of what is a disability that didn't initially constitute me, and thus I had to work on that. But yeah.
How often you face that folks who work for USA government dehumanize neurodivergent people?
I mean, I think one of the experiences I would talk about, and again, I don't like talking that much about my own personal experience, but basically is that in general, people will treat you well if you're perceived as one of the good ones, basically. If you meet all the respectability politics, so to speak, you're going to get treated well and accepted. But that leaves out everyone who doesn't meet that respectability of having the law degree or dressing well or being soft-spoken or whatever else that means.
Okay, and how all this respectability stuff works? I mean, why they listen to you but not listen other neurodivergent people?
Well, it's all about respectability politics, basically.
Yeah.
If you have a law degree, if you don't exhibit the symptoms, whatever that means, you're not seen as the scary mentally ill, basically. You're not perceived as the person who needs to be locked up. And thus, we are leaving out all the people that we don't like because they don't meet our stereotype of how you should behave in society, basically.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell this story that you told me previously about women in Congress who hates bipolar people? I think it's very good example of stereotypes.
Well, it was basically going into that whole who are the good ones, what is the good mentally disabled and who is the bad mentally disabled, which was that I was in a congressional office in Washington, D.C., talking about a bill that would have harmed a lot people with mental illness. And I was discussing how this bill was really bad because it would weaken medical privacy protections and so on. And this staffer, a chief of staff for a member of Congress, tells me, well, you need to understand these are serious mental illnesses we're talking about, like bipolar and schizophrenia, scary shit. And I was like, oh, you mean like me and my wife were both bipolar? And then it was an interesting, hilarious event of having this poor woman try to dig herself out of the hole she had just gotten into, being like, well, if it's well managed, if it's not, if it's treated, or basically trying to say you're one of the good ones. I'm not talking about you specifically. And that is, if anyone wants to read more about him, there's an essay in title "Who Gets to Be the Activist" that I wrote for the Alice Wong anthology that talks about that story a lot of who gets to be the activist, who gets to be considered good, disabled, and thus gets in the inspiration porn picture, basically. But yeah.
Can you tell a little bit about your latest success with your work with government? Some stuff that you're proud of.
I would say something I'm proud of was in DC, in the District of Columbia. We passed, there are bills banning conversion therapy in the US, and they focus on conversion therapy on minors under 18, mainly because they can be coerced by parents into the treatment, into this torture that they call treatment at times. And the thing was that it's leaving out people who are under guardianship because of a mental health or intellectual disability, but are adults, are over the age of 18, who can then be coerced by their parents or guardians. And we used the District of Columbia as the guinea pig to prove, look, we can do this without the sky falling. And we were able to shepherd the bill from start to finish of having it introduced and then passed in the council, basically saying you have banning conversion therapy on adults under guardianship, basically. And we achieved it. So yeah.
Yeah. And can you tell about some not so successful projects, about some what was maybe the most difficult stuff? Ideas.
The most difficult task are you thinking about?
I mean, what do you have experience when you try to lobby some projects, some ideas, some bills, but it wasn't success? It was very difficult to explain.
I mean, I think it was a mixed success when we tried really hard to pass the bill to oppose the Murphy bill a few years back around mental illness, which was the one that led to that story in Congress that I have. But the thing about it was that when it came to that, we had to basically limit ourselves to watering the bill down because it inevitably passed as part of a broader healthcare funding bill. But our goal was to tone it down to the point that it focused on regulations rather than changing the HIPAA statute, the privacy statute. So yeah, that was a very hard moment. But yeah.
And do most of the people in your state government understand social model of disability, or they prefer medical model when you speak with them about disability?
It depends. Most people don't even understand what are the models of disability. I would say that while I personally shift a lot in the social model a bit, in the idea that disability is a social construct to an extent, but all the model ideas are flawed in some way or other. Like that is not, like disability is not going to go away because culture changes, for example. Medical disability is ignoring how people often don't necessarily want or need to be treated. And the charity model is bad enough to begin with because it sees us as objects of pity, and I can keep on going. I would say a lot of the policymakers I have to deal with often work from a charity model of, oh my God, these poor disabled people we need to work with. If that makes sense, and that is a constant challenge because you have to approach it from a perspective of having to challenge the idea that we are not to be pitied. Fuck your pity, basically.
Yeah, I understand because I have problems like this in Russia. But the way I think it's one of the reasons why groups like Autism Speaks is so influential, yeah, because they use this charity model.
Exactly.
And do more people and more decision makers in USA started to listen to autistic people, not to organizations like Autism Speaks? And what's going on with Autism Speaks influence in recent years?
I mean, Autism Speaks is basically a hate group at this point because it focuses on the idea that autism needs to be cured, that it's this horrible disease, basically, and this tragedy that befalls on the family instead of a variation of the autistic person, instead of part of their identity, instead of someone who needs to be respected and their needs met, basically. But like when it comes to Autism Speaks, there's so much wrong with them that I can't even start. It's almost hard to summarize it, but yeah.
Do they become less influential in recent years?
They sometimes try to say that they've toned it down, but honestly, a lot of people feel that they haven't. And they still see themselves as a parent-run organization focused on ending the quote-unquote epidemic of autism. So that is simply not going to fly.
Yeah, and why so many people prefer to listen to parents-run organization, not to autistic organization? What the main
Because they have more resources. The parent-led organizations have the resources and respectability of exploiting the already existing charity model around disability. And also in that sense, they also get to exploit the resources of said parents, while a lot of autistic people are living in poverty or living in disability benefits and so on, and thus have fewer resources to rely on. So yeah.
Yeah. And what the main stereotypes about autistic people in USA society?
I mean, one of the things I would talk about heavily is how when it comes to healthcare, we exclude people with developmental disabilities. What I was gonna say is that when it comes to that, people with developmental disabilities are routinely the victims of violence, be it by parents, where it's seen as a mercy killing, because the poor parent was so exhausted and exploited by having to take care of the autistic child, or for that matter, by police perpetrated violence, where we are much more likely to be the victims and perpetrators of. And for that matter, when it comes to institutions like guardianship, which is essentially a civil death when it comes to our identities, and long-term institutionalization, there is a lot of problems facing us. So yeah.
And what the most marginalized groups of autistic people?
I would say autistic people of color, autistic queer people, everyone who lives at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities were multiply marginalized, because they face also the impacts of racism, of homophobia, of transphobia, autistic immigrants who also face xenophobia and the mistreatment of organizations like ICE and other immigration authorities, and risk of deportation, and I can keep on going.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit about all these problems, for example, about problems of autistic Black people and autistic immigrants?
I mean, there the problem is autistic immigrants are routinely seen as this charge on society. Oh, they will cost lots of money. And you see it a lot in many countries with certain socialized healthcare systems like Canada that don't even let immigrants, disabled immigrants immigrate into the country because there will be a supposed burden on the medical system. In the US, we have seen attempts to pass such rules where if you receive any type of public assistance, then we won't let you become naturalized as a citizen. When such rules have been existed from the Trump administration. And thus, we also see where, say, a deportation might mean losing access to the healthcare that you need to stay alive, for example. Finally, when it comes to Black autistic people, we think of police brutality. Like, if you're Black, you're already much more likely to be the victim of police violence or of being killed by police. If you're Black and are seen as somehow aggressive because you're flapping your hands because you don't do eye contact and so forth, you are even more likely to be a victim. So yeah.
Yeah, and what about, for example, autistic asylum seeker or refugee? Yeah, it's a little personal question for me because I am autistic asylum seeker.
It's okay. I mean, there I would say it is an issue that we must confront where we must see all the countries where autistic people don't receive treatment or aren't even recognized, thus see that as a marginalized class, as a reasonable fear class for purposes of asylum seeking, basically. And this intersects a lot with gender identity and sexual orientation when you are an LGBTQ person facing persecution abroad and so on. So yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about LGBT autistic problems in USA?
I mean, they're one of the biggest issues that we see a lot. One example is, for example, the autism diagnosis or history of being autistic being used as a barrier to transition for trans people, where they will be either told that that you can't possibly be trans because you're autistic, where it will be denied that they're autistic for women because of the supposed extreme male brain theory that has been debunked for years now. I'm so sorry about the dog.
Yeah, it's okay.
Please shut up for a second. And also in the process, we do see an increase in violence where we see guardianship being applied by parents who will try to use it as an excuse to say, oh, they couldn't possibly know better of being trans because they're autistic, because of their mental disability and so on. So yeah.
And if person don't have civil rights, if his or those their parents are their guardians, is it difficult to achieve or how to explain it? Is it difficult to make this person have his own right again? Make decision again?
It's difficult for the person to recover civil rights. It is, in some cases, almost impossible at times, depending on the state a lot. We are trying to move towards an assisted decision-making model. In some states, the person will still be in charge of choosing who helps them out, but it's completely under minor-style guardianship.
Yeah. And can you speak a little bit of the problem of people with other mental diagnoses, not autistic people, but for example, bipolar people or people with dissociative identity disorder or etc. Yeah.
So one thing I would say there is that God,
No.
Trixie, please shut up. Did we feed you already? I don't know. I would say that one of the things facing people with other mental health disabilities is that they need to they're constantly facing discrimination and accessing healthcare because they won't be believed when they experience physical disabilities. Trixie, please. Hang on.
Yeah.
One of the things around physical mental health disabilities is also police violence, where, like I say, if you have a heart attack and somebody freaks out and call 911 or 999 in the UK, is what happens is that an ambulance full of paramedics arrives. But if it's a mental health crisis, the people that arrive are the police officers with guns, basically, at least in the US, where police is armed. And in the process, that often ends up with a person dead instead of receiving any sort of help. For what it's worth, that the system can help them. Additionally, one thing to keep in mind is the involvement of violence, where people are constantly being told or being seen as likely to be perpetrators of violence, where they are more likely to be victims of violence. And you see this debate constantly around the gun control debate in the US. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's even worse with, for example, mentally ill Black people or autistic Black people or with mentally ill Muslim. Yeah, it's double stigma.
Yeah.
I remind you what I want to ask about legal capacity. Yeah, I just forget this word. Sometimes it happens that I forget some words. So about legal capacity that parents have toward their kids. If some parents don't want, their autistic kids to have a legal capacity, it's easy for these parents to take guardianship.
They can often secure guardianship against the kid's will, to be very honest. Like, that is a very difficult issue, going back to the guardianship issue. Yeah. And very often the autistic person is certainly listened to in court.
And how often this happens, and what autistic people are more vulnerable?
It's autistic people in general, but there is entirely the perception, if you are not seen as being able to fend for yourself and whatnot, you're much more likely to be forced into it. Also, people in independent study programs at schools are routinely being shunted into that, where school counselors will tell parents that they need to get guardianship over a child when they turn 18 and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, and what about problems of non-speaking autistic people?
That is exactly where you have a lot of vulnerability. That said, about guardianship, I would encourage you to talk to somebody like Sam Crane or whatnot over at the Autistic Self-advocacy Network, or Lydia.
Okay, and I think maybe last 2-3 questions. What you can say about autistic people with other mental diagnoses? Is it difficult to, for example, be diagnosed as bipolar or as a person with schizophrenia if you have autistic diagnosis or not?
I mean, that part I'm not entirely sure about. There isn't that much literature, but it is more likely for you to have mental health disabilities, especially around trauma and whatnot. But then being autistic plays against you in terms of accessing even more the mental health care that you're trying to get, or for that matter, that you're trying to avoid if it's being forced on you.
Yeah. And do it often happen that in mental health systems, they try to make you normal, but not help you really. I mean, for example, if autistic person said that they had depression, if most of the mental health specialists was treating depression, not to try to make autistic person look less autistic, or what's the problem with this?
So I would say it is a problem in mental health care, like going into coercion treatment and so on. And I'm actually going to send you a piece once it's published that I'm writing about mental health care and coercion in New York State and how it impacts disproportionately people of color. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And what changed in the law and in attitude toward neurodivergent people and mental disabled people in maybe the last 5 years? What the main changes?
To be very honest, in the last 5 years, I'm not sure much has changed, to be very honest. Like, things still suck. And the Trump administration made it worse, so we're still trying to fix things a bit.
Yeah. So Trump and between Obama administration and Bush administration, is something changed or not?
Sorry?
Between Obama administration and Bush administration, if something changed or not. So it was worse when it was Bush, after that better when Obama, and after that was when Trump. Something like this.
I mean, Bush was basically before my time in activism, so I'm not going to try to speak too much on that. But with Trump, we saw a lot of regression when it came to regulations and enforcement in agencies and so on.
Yeah, and do you believe that in Biden administration it would be better? What you could say?
I'm personally hopeful that it will be better. I'm personally hopeful of that.
Yeah. And what the main problems was in Trump administration in disability right area? Lack
of having disability liaisons at the White House, further and too much focus on religious quote unquote freedoms and not enough focus on disability, problems around the refusing to enforce sexual orientation and gender identity protections. I can keep on going. We could do a whole session about that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think the last question, what you want to say to a new generation of autistic kids?
Hang in there, basically. Like, it gets better. Like, I know it's cliche, but yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much to share your opinion and expertise. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everyone. Share this video.
Bye.
Back to our channel. Bye.